So I want to bring out, I think it's clear already just how radical what Wittgenstein's doing is. I mean, the negative point that there is nothing in your head that constitutes you understanding a sign the way you do, or you meaning a sign the way you do. That seems to me absolutely compelling. We've just got to live with that, so far as I can see. But then the question is, what happens to the notions of understanding and meaning? And right from the start of this class, I've been saying, well, a language is where you have standards of right and wrong, of truth and falsity. And the way that works is we have references for the signs. Each name stands for an object. And the whole strategy was figure out how names stand for objects, figure out how it can be that there's a condition for a predicate, a general term, to apply to an object. Then if you've got that, we'll understand how sentences can be true or false. And then we'll know how language works. But if what Wittgenstein's saying is right, that whole approach was a mistake. The notions of truth and reference are not basic in an understanding of language. What is basic is just the use that we make of the signs. What's basic is how we use signs in particular contexts. Nothing is more fundamental than that. So the picture that you naturally have is, when I understand a sentence, I know what would have to be the case for that sentence to be true. So you know what it is for snow to be white. That tells you how to understand the sentence, snow is white. And then if you want to know whether snow is white, what you do is you look at the world and see if it matches up to the meaning of the signs. And that gives you your justification for saying snow is white. What could be plainer than that? You see what I mean? But what he's done has been to throw out that picture. There's no such thing as knowing what would have to be the case for snow to be white. All that happens is that in particular cases, you apply the words to particular objects. You say, that's snow, that's white. And there is no standard of right and wrong that your uses have to match up to. So I want to begin with a very simple example of what you do in this approach, how you describe the use of a sign. Then the thing about use, the way we use signs, is that it can be criticized. We often criticize the way people use signs. If you think about anyone talking about politically correct language, or, you know, for everyone in the room, each of you will have some words that just when you hear them, it already makes your blood boil. I mean, some ways of using words just seem to be wrong. We can criticize these ways of using words. Or when Descartes was saying, maybe the world is not the way we think it is, he was saying, look, I understand all the words of my language, but the bases on which we apply these words, the contexts in which we use the words, we don't use them right. If Wittgenstein's right, there's no way of criticizing use. You can't criticize the uses that you make of signs. And there's a very pure, simple laboratory case that's in that prior article of a sign called tonk, where there seems to be something wrong with the use of the sign. But in Wittgenstein's approach, it's very hard to say whether it is this wrong with the use of the sign. So let me just start out by saying something about how you describe the use of a particular sign. Suppose you consider the sign and. How do we use the sign and? Well, if you've got a proposition A and a proposition B, if you've got both of those, then you can move from that to A and B. If you know that the cat hunts and you know that the dog fights, you can move from that to the cat hunts and the dog fights. All right so far? That's just the way we use and If you get this as input, you get that as output. Right? That's the use of the sign. Suppose you've got A and B. If A and B are both all right, then is A right? If you can say A and B, then you must be able to say A, right? So if you can say the cat hunts and the dog fights, then you can move from that to the cat hunts. Okay, you look spellbound. Follow me very closely. So this is the rules for AND. This is how you use AND. If you get A and if you get B, then you get A and B. And if you get A and B, you get A. And if you get A and B, you get B. Right? So I just described nothing about truth or reference here. That's just the way we use the signs. There are input rules and output rules. You can program a machine to use AND like that. You're programmed to use AND like that. Okay. That's all right for AND? Okay. What about OR? If you get A, you get A or B. Is that all right? You get the cat hunts, then you get the cat hunts or the dog fights. No? Yeah. Surely if you get A, then one or the other of A and B must be right. What's the problem?
I don't see how you can I can see how you can go from A or B to A.
No, it's not. It's round the other way. You can go from A to A or B. How can you go from A or B to A? Oh, you don't get how you can go from A or B to A?
No, I do.
Come back to this. Okay. I say if you know that the cat hunts, then you know that either the cat hunts or the dog fights. That's easy. Yeah. And similarly, if you know that the dog fights, then you know that either the cat hunts or the dog fights. Okay, suppose you know that either A or B, what can you derive from that? So this is inputs to OR, right? What are the outputs? Suppose you've got A or B. What can you get as output? Can you get A as output? No, they're against you. You get A or B, you don't know whether A, right? You don't know whether B. You know one or the other, but you don't know either, if you see what I mean. You don't know each. You can't get A from A or B, and you can't get B from A or B. Okay, so what can you get? What good does it do you if you know that A or B? Well, if you got A or B, and you can get C from A, and you can get C from B, then what you know is that one way or another, C. Yep.
But if C were A, then you could get from A or B, you could get A.
If C were A, yeah. So if from A, yeah, if C is A, then from A you can get A, right? And suppose that from B you can get A, then you get A. That's right. But you have to get, but to do this, you have to get A from B. So if A follows from B,
yeah.
Okay.
I mean, we're assuming things about C here, so why not assume things about A?
no, I just said if you can get C from A, and if you can get C from B, then you can get C from A or B alone, right? And similarly, if you can get B from A, if you can get A from B, then if you know the A or B, then you can get A. That's all right. That's consistent. Yeah. Okay? So if, for example, as often happens, I find myself thinking, either I left it in the lecture room or I left it in my office, right? So I'm employing my powerful mind to try to figure out where the power adapter is. I think either I left it in the lecture room or I left it in my office. And if I left it in the lecture room, then it'll be at the front desk. Okay? And if I left it in the office, it'll be at the front desk. Then, one way or another, you can say it'll be at the front desk. That's what good it does you knowing that A or B. You don't like that. No, you don't like that. The desk here are quite that is true. What I mean is, if I have this as a premise, right, and if I can draw these conclusions, right, if I have these premises, yeah, then I can conclude this. It'll be at the front desk. But you're right. These pathways might not be correct. Yeah. But suppose they are correct. Yeah. That's all I say. Suppose they are correct. In one way or another, it follows it'll be at the front desk. Okay. So notice there's not a word about truth or reference here. This is just describing the uses that you make the signs, the patterns of use that you make of the signs. I mean, as was just pointed out, you might need a lot of additional premises to make this work. Right? So then you say, well, let's have these additional premises in. And if then from A I can get C, and from B I can get C, then from A or B I can get C, on the assumption of those other premises. So I don't say this is all that newsworthy, but it's just important that you be absolutely secure with this. Okay? That's all right? Okay. There you are. There's a description of use. So Wittgenstein is saying, if you've got that for a sign, then you know the meaning. What more do you want to know? If you didn't know what and or meant, I just described the meanings of and or to you. And now all you have to do is use them in that pattern. Nothing about truth, nothing about reference. Just do it. Don't ask why. Just use the signs that way. That's all there is to do. That's all there is to understanding and meaning. If everybody else does it, then if you do that, you'll be fine. Okay. So your use of the sign can't be criticized. You apply the terms the way you do, that can't be criticized. I mean, the traditional view, the natural view, is that you can criticize the use of a sign. I mean, take scientists with a hypothesis. You say, look, maybe electrons all spin clockwise when you look at them from the direction they're going in. That makes sense, right? Hello, does that make sense? Electrons could all spin clockwise. I mean, maybe they don't. Maybe they all go in different directions. Maybe they don't spin at all. But it might be that they all spin clockwise. How would you know? How could you find out? Well, I might propose an experiment. I'm not going to, but you can imagine that I might propose an experiment. If I did, that would be subject to criticism. You could say, no, that's not the right way to find out. If I had a hypothesis about what was happening on this spot 1,000 years ago, I say, I bet there were humans at this spot 1,000 years ago. Well, understanding it, knowing what it means is one thing, and then what's a good way to find out whether it's true? That's another question. That's a further question. Yeah. So the natural picture is, you know what has to be so for these sentences to be true, and then you can ask, what's a good way to find out if they're true, and what are the implications of the sentence? But that requires that understanding a sign is something that lets you know what has to be the case for a sentence containing the sign to be true. And then given that you've got that knowledge of the condition for it to be true, you could criticize the inputs and outputs to people's uses of the sign, the pattern of use that they make of the sign. So that is the natural picture. You've got your input to the application of the sign, you've got knowledge of what it takes for an application of the sign to be correct, and then there's the output from your application of the sign. Does Wittgenstein accept or reject this picture? Does Wittgenstein say anything remotely relevant to this picture? Yes? What's your guess? Yes?
There's no fact of the matter of the middle part. There's no.
Yeah, there's no such thing, right?
thing.
Yeah.
There's
There's,
input, output.
there's only the inputs and outputs. Is that what you had in mind? Good, right, right. Thank God. Okay. Please don't do this to me. Right. Okay. Okay, so the picture is there are only the inputs and outputs. Given that you've got this, if you've got this bit in the middle, then you can ask, are these the right inputs to be using? Are those the right outputs? But if you don't have the bit in the middle, there's no question to be raised about whether those inputs and outputs are appropriate. I mean, the natural picture is your knowledge of what has to be so for a sentence to be true. Someone a couple of classes ago used the notion of the goal or your objective in using a sign. You would naturally think, look, when I say the cat is in the mat, the cup is on the table, knowing what has to be true so for that sentence to be true, that states your objective when you're trying to find out whether the sentence is true. So if you take a sentence like A of the form A and B, the cat hunts and the dog fights, then knowing what has to be the case for that sentence to be true, that's why you say, well, if I've got A and I've got B, then I can draw this conclusion. That's going to be a good way of finding out whether that's true. Given that I know what the hypothesis is, I can try and find an experiment to test for it. That tells me what my objective is in designing the experiment. And then you can ask you the methods you typically use to achieve that objective. I mean, Descartes is a good example of someone who says, I know we have all these hypotheses, like there are physical objects in the world has existed for a long time, there are lots of other people around. There are all these hypotheses, and we usually use sense impressions as our ways of finding out whether these hypotheses are true. But maybe sense impressions are not good ways of finding out whether these hypotheses are true. Because the sense impressions could be just the way they are, even though all these hypotheses were false. So that's what he's doing. He's saying, consider the pattern of inputs to our usual judgments. They might not be good inputs. If Wittgenstein's right, there's no such question to be asked. If you're going to say there is only the use or there is only the custom or the practice or the technique, then you can't possibly criticize the ways we have of using the terms. There's no criticism to be made. How could there be? If I just explained, I just explained to you what and or mean by these kinds of rules, right? If you didn't know what and or meant, you'd now know what they meant because I just explained the rules for them. You would not then be in a position to say, but those rules are no good. That was all there was to the meaning. So if all there is to our understanding of statements like there are physical objects around us, there's a cup on the table, all these ordinary statements about the medium-sized world, if there's only the use, there's only the custom, it can't be criticized. There's nothing else that it's trying to keep faith with. It has no further objective. You can't say, is this a good way of reaching that objective, or is it a bad way of reaching the objective? It has no objective. It's not grounded in anything. It's not based on anything. It's not trying to do anything. It's only when you have these kinds of customs or practices or techniques in place that you can then try and do something. They're the background to any kind of attempts or objectives you might have. So in Wittgenstein's kind of picture, the use that you make of a sign just can't be criticized. So that gives you a way of replying to Descartes. It has some similarities to Putnam's way of replying to Descartes, but it's not the same. It just says, we have our forms of life, we have our ways of talking, and they are all fine just as they stand. And Descartes' picture on which you could keep all the ways of talking, but just abandon our ordinary customs or practices or uses, that makes no sense. Descartes was not in a position to hold on to the meanings of the signs he was using. Suppose you're asking, is this a cube? Is that a cube? Is that over there a cube? I mean, that's the kind of question that Descartes was asking. Do you know that that's a cube over there? Do you know that that's something made of concrete? Well, if what you have is the image of a cube, some picture of what is required for an object to match up to the requirements in being a cube, then you could say, well, maybe our ordinary way of finding out whether this is a cube and that's a cube is no good. Maybe our ordinary sense impressions don't tell us about whether things are six-sided. But on Wittgenstein's picture, that notion of the image of the cube, what you're trying to get at when you say this is a cube, that's a cube, that just drops out. All you're left with as fixing the meaning of the sign is the way we go on in particular cases. So the way we go on in particular cases can't be justified or criticized. It just has to be accepted as it stands. There's no possibility of criticizing our way of talking. The thing is, we do think there are ways of criticizing ways of talking. This just rules out the possibility of skepticism. It says, you can't criticize our ways of using and. The way we have of using and is just, we'll use and however we like, and we don't want anybody criticizing us. You can't criticize us. We'll just talk the way we like. But consider a notion like which. I mean, people used to use the notion of a which in perfect seriousness. They had a custom or practice of classifying people as witches. They had their grounds on which they said people were witches. They said things like, this person is old, female, poor, unpleasant. That's the basis on which I say she's a witch. And then the implication of that is, we can burn her. We can destroy her. That's our practice. That's the way of our people. That's the meaning of the sign. And you can't criticize that. You can't be skeptical about our ways of finding out whether someone's a witch, because we have no objective. There is nothing like the image, the definition of a witch that you have to match up to. There's just the way we talk in particular cases. That's our form of life. So it can't be problematic. There's only, this is a witch, that's a witch, that over there is a witch. And then there's what we do, the outputs from those decisions. The thing is, people do tend to suppose that you can criticize that. That this is, in fact, something you can rationally criticize. It's not just, well, that was the way of their people and now we do things a different way. We think we've got it right and they had it wrong. But there is a puzzle for anyone impressed by Wittgenstein's negative points as to how that can be. How can there be such a thing as criticizing the notion of a witch? And from a Wittgensteinian point of view, it looks as if there's just our practice and their practice, and neither can be said to be better than the other. Anyone who thinks that some of the language that we currently use is problematic in the way that the notion of a witch was problematic, is saying Wittgenstein was not right about this. There have to be ways of criticizing how we talk. You can't just say it comes to an end. This is what we do. Here we reach bedrock and the spade is turned. There has to be some way of criticizing our ordinary use of language. Okay. Well, Prior gives a really good example. maybe on Monday I'll talk a bit more about the politically problematic cases. Not with actual examples because it gets too emotional, but in a more abstract way. But Pryor gives a very simple kind of laboratory case of a term where you want to say, no, your use of that term is unacceptable. You can't use a sign that way. And it really seems like you just can't, with which maybe you could be softened up a bit. Maybe you could be made to think, well, actually, maybe maybe it wasn't too bad. Maybe it wasn't as bad as they really say. But Pryor's example, it really is very clear that something has gone badly wrong. But just remember the way I was explaining the use of and. Sorry, here we go. Right, so that seems like a perfectly reasonable way of explaining the meaning of a sign. Yeah, I mean that's the way. If any of you did logic, that's the way that across the world people are drilled in the use of and in elementary logic. That's the first thing that happens to you in philosophy. You're drilled in this, and then you're told, now you know what it means, right? Now get on with it. Now you're one of us, right? So, and this is what he seems to be saying. Look, a person goes by a signpost only insofar as there exists a regular use of a signpost. Don't ask what the objectives are. Just ask, how are they used? What's the custom? When you're understanding a language does not mean knowing what has to be the case for the sentences to be true. It's just being master of a technique, the skill of actually using the words in the right patterns, in the right contexts. There's a way of grasping the rule that's not an interpretation, not a matter of knowing what it takes for signs using the rule to be true or false, but which is exhibited in what we call obeying the rule, using the word, applying the word in particular cases, and going against the use of the rule in particular cases. So there's a way of grasping the rule for which that is not a matter of knowing a definition or having a picture in your head of what a which is, but understanding the rule for which is just what you call obeying the rule, saying that's a which in the right cases and going against it in particular cases, where this is just a matter of following along with the regular use of the sign. If that's the way your people use it, that's fine. So Pryor describes a technique or a custom or a practice of using the word tonk in the following way. And the background question is there going to be any possibility of criticizing this use of the sign tonk? So here's the introduction rule, here's the input rule for tonk. It's just like the rule for or. If you get A, you can say A or B. If you get B, you can say A or B. Okay, so for that was all right? That's perfectly well defined. So for tonk, if you get A, you can say A tonk B, and if you get B, you can say A tonk B. Right? You didn't know what tonk meant before, but now you're a lot further on the way. Okay, is this bit of the rule crystal clear? Okay. So what's the output? Well, okay, if you get A, you can get A. If you say the cat hunts, you can say the cat hunts, tonk, Rolly smokes. Does that follow? If I say Rolly smokes, what conclusion can we draw from that? If I say Rolly smokes, please. If I say Rolly smokes, what conclusion can we draw from that? Thank you. That was very kind. Yeah. Okay, that's plain as day. Okay. So that was the input rule for tonk. So the output rule for tonk is like the output rule for and. The output rule for and was if you get A and B, then you get A, and if you get A and B, then you get B. So that's perfectly well defined output rule. Then we just have that output rule for tonk. As you get A tonk B, you get A, and as you get A tonk B, you get B. So this is all perfectly well defined. You now know the input rules and the output rules. Is there some contradiction in what I said? Yep.
If you have A and then A tonk B follows, how could you have B following from A tonk B while you're given originally with A?
Well, that's just the rule. Look, I just explained to you what tonk means, right? And you said, look, from the cat hunts, it follows that the cat hunts, tonk Raleigh smokes, right? That's the definition. I mean, that's what it means.
But if you have the cat hunts and then you have the cat hunts, tonk Raleigh smokes,
Yep.
then you could look at that premise, and from that you would get that Raleigh smokes.
That's right. Look, that's the output rule. The cat hunts, tonk Raleigh smokes, so Raleigh smokes.
The cat hunts.
Uh-huh. So what's your point? I mean,
I guess I'm just having trouble grasping how it would.
well, it's just like, look, if you ask, how do I get from A and B? Suppose I have, look, suppose you consider this kind of argument. Either I left it in the lecture room or I left it in my office, right? And you say, well, how does that work? Like someone was asking me, how does that work? That's not right, yeah. And I say, look, these use OR, right? This is the way OR works. That's the rule, right? That's how it works. That's the pattern of use for OR. What more do you want to know? I mean, that was just the meaning of the sign. You should try this in your logic class sometime, right? You say, you do some complex proof, and you say, yeah, but you just walk through the rules there. That doesn't mean it's right. You see how subversive that's going to be of logic? Yeah? In fact, don't do this. It would be practically very disadvantageous to you to do this. So don't do it, right? Just do what they tell you. But all I'm saying here is, look, I just explained what tonk, the rules for tonk are, the way you explain the rules for the use of any logical sign. Yeah? And all I'm saying now is just follow the rules. I hope no one is, yeah?
What if B is not A? Like,
Okay.
Like the total opposite of A. Then if A, then A tonk not A. But then if A
If
tonk
A,
not A, then you have
then A tonk not A. That's right, yeah. And you got A tonk not A, so not A. Right.
But also A.
But also A, that's true.
A at the same time.
So you get A and not A, right? So then you could conclude A tonk, not A, and yeah.
So it's not a problem that you can have A and not A at the same time.
Well, maybe we shouldn't make that inference. I mean, maybe you shouldn't think about it. But really, I mean, you're just applying the rule. Well, if you must, yeah.
The cat hunts and the cat, or if you have the cat hunts, then you have the cat hunts tonk. The cat doesn't hunt.
Right.
So you have the cat hunts tonk. The cat doesn't hunt. So therefore, the cat hunts and the cat doesn't hunt.
Yeah.
Isn't that a problem?
It is a what is that cat doing? Yeah.
Or does that have nothing to do with the point you're trying to make?
It is a problem. Yeah. I mean, but look, I mean, this is perfectly well defined, right? And I explained it just the same way you explain the meaning of and or the meaning of or. Yeah, I mean, is there some obscurity in this? I mean, everyone was nodding off when I went through this. I mean, which so if it was obscure, it wasn't obscure in an interesting way. I mean, right? But this is perfectly clear, right? What could be clearer than that? I'm just laying down the pattern of use. And it's the same kind of pattern of use that you got for and or. So you say you get A, and you get A tonk B, and you get A tonk B, then you get B. So from A, you can derive B, no matter what B is. This may just be a great advance. I mean, remember all those tedious proofs you used to have to do in logic? Yeah? I mean, if you just had tonk, then the whole thing would be very much easier. I mean, and next time you're in a political argument and you feel that your back is against the wall, you could just say, let me share with you some insights from my theory of meaning class. Let me tell you about tonk. And then you'll be able to prove practically anything you want, right? In fact, you'll be able to prove anything at all. Look at the convenience of that. Yeah, the cat hunts, tonk, Rolly smokes. The cat hunts, tonk, Rolly smokes. So Rolly smokes, that's just what you said, right? Prior wrote, tonk, Wittgenstein was wrong. Therefore, Wittgenstein was wrong. Oh. I don't know if Wittgenstein meant that. How could Wittgenstein be wrong? Well, is there any problem for this account of this description of meaning? I mean, the whole appeal of Wittgenstein's account was it said there's only our custom or practice. There's no way of criticizing it from an external standpoint. So if we come upon some hitherto unknown people who've got tonk in their language, and they talk just like that, then we don't have any way of criticizing them. We have to say that's great. Maybe we should do it too. There's no criticism to be given of this way of using tonk in Wittgenstein's account. And what's wrong with it anyway? I mean, you guys seem quite sure that there's something wrong. But what is wrong? Yeah. It's illogical. It's not illogical. Look, it's perfectly well defined. It's at least as clean and precisely characterized a logical sign as any other. I mean, if you're going to say this is illogical, you have to say and is illogical too. And or. Yeah? I mean, these are signs whose pattern of use is described in just the same way.
But and doesn't arrive at a contradiction. A and not A.
Oh, is that what you mean? You can derive a contradiction?
Yeah.
Ah. Okay. So you can derive a contradiction from it that you're not to use it. Well.
Yes.
Right. Yeah. I wonder if that's really... I mean, suppose it went round the other way. What I mean is, suppose you said, actually, I'm going to do something else. I'm going to say, here's a new here's a new friend. Here is Tonk's peculiar younger brother, right? So here, I'm going to define star, right? So the rule for star is, if I've got A and I've got B, I've got A star B. Right? That's all right. That's perfectly well defined. That's like the rule for and. And the output rule for star is, if you got A, and if from A you can get C, and if from B you can get C, then, if you get A star B, is you've got A star B, and if from A you can get C, and if from B you can get C, then from A star B you can get C. Right? That's the output rule. Okay. So that's like the output rule for OR. Yes? So this is kind of Tonk flipped round. You see what I mean? So you're not going to get any contradiction here. How can there be a contradiction? You have to be so cautious in everything you say. I mean, I say to you, it looks like rain, star. That was a great question you raised in class. Should you be pleased? I mean, on the one hand, the introduction rule is I had to have both. It looks like rain, and that was a great question, in order for me to have said, it looks like rain, star. That was a great question you raised in class. So if you get that, you might think, yes, I'm quite pleased about that. On the other hand, I mean, assuming you care a bit, but anyway. On the other hand, if you know that it looks like rain, star, that was a great question you raised, can you conclude from that 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 was a great question you raised? No. You can only conclude it from, this is the output rule. The output rule is here. The output rule is not from A star B, you can infer A, and from A star B, you can infer B. The output rule says only if you can get C from each of A and B, then you can get C from A star B. So can you conclude, when I say that thing, can you conclude from that 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 was a great question you raised? No, because it doesn't follow from the fact that it's that it looks like rain, that that was a great question you raised. So you can't get the output. So this is subtler than Tonk, right? Because it is the weird little brother. Tonk is kind of swaggering and boisterous, and you get a contradiction almost immediately, as you ably spotted, right? This one, you're not going to get a contradiction. You see what I mean? Because it's so cautious in what it lets you do. But given that it's so cautious, what is someone saying when they use star? What does it mean when someone uses star? And in the face of it, this is just as weird as Tonk. So it's not just that you can get a contradiction that's the problem. Something weirder is going wrong. And in a way, that's got to be the general point, that with witchcraft, it wasn't that you said to people, but, well, if you use this notion of a witch, you're going to get a contradiction. It was some other problem. Yep. That's right.
But then also it seems like within any community there's going to be a whole bunch of different customs operating at the same time.
Uh-huh.
And some of those may be inconsistent with each other.
Very good.
And
Yeah.
that could provide grounds for criticizing one.
Excellent. Yeah. Yeah. So you can criticize some customs in the light of others, but that doesn't mean that we're going to reinstate the old picture that says we've got this kind of thing in our head that's telling us how to use the sign. That's your point. Yeah. Yeah. That is very interesting. And how would it work for this case, though? How would it work for Tonk? I mean, if it's just a new sign. I mean, if you say, look, nobody's ever used arrow before, the logical sign arrow. Here's how I'm going to use it. And you can't say, yes, well, we're going to criticize that because we use all the other logical signs in all these other ways already. You see what I mean? What are the details? How's it going to work here? I criticize the practice of using Tonk in the light of the way I use and or. How does that go? It's just another sign. That's true. They don't pick out objects in the wild. Okay. I think maybe we'll carry on with this a little bit on Monday. Is that all right? And then move on to the Davidson on reality without reference. Okay. Thanks.